This is Mrs. Pullen for lesson 8.02 for Algebra 2. In this video, I'm going to go over two examples showing how to graph trig functions that have vertical shifts. So we're first asked to graph the function y equals 4 sine of x minus 2. And we also need to say the range in interval notation, and we're going to be graphing two cycles. So the first thing you need to do is pull off key information. So I need to pull off the amplitude, and the amplitude is the absolute value of the number that appears to the left of the function. So in this case, the function sine of x, and the absolute value of 4 is 4. And next we want to determine the vertical shift, and that's the number that you're either add or subtract to the function. So in this case, it would be -2. So that tells me the shift, and it's shifting the function down two spaces. It also tells me what the midline is. So the midline is the horizontal line that goes through that point. So it would be y equals -2. And before I continue, let's graph that equation of that midline. I want it median thickness. Let's see. I want purple line, medium thickness, and we're going to graph y equals -2. And it's always important to label that equation. Next, I want to figure out the maximum and minimum value of that function. So to figure that out, there are a bunch of ways, but probably the easiest is to just use the formula. You take the amplitude and you add the vertical shift. And so I'm going to take 4 and add to it the -2. And so the maximum value of this graph is 2. To get the minimum value of the graph, you're going to take the negative of the amplitude plus the vertical shift. And so this would be -4 minus 2 or -6. Next, we're going to figure out the general pattern for the sine function. So I'm going to make a little unit circle here, because really everything is from the unit circle. And so at 0 degrees, we have the point 1, 0. At 90 or pi over 2, we have 0, 1. At pi, we have the point -1, 0. And at 270, we have the point 0, -1. We're looking at sine, so think of the y coordinate. And so the normal pattern for sine would be 0, 1, 0, -1, 0. So the general pattern is really you're graphing from the midline, then the maximum value, back to the midline, then to the minimum value, and back to the midline. But in this case, the midline is -2. The maximum value is 2. The midline again is -2. The minimum value is -6, and the midline is -2. And so let's graph that from 0. So it's going to be -2 to 2. So mid, max, mid, min, mid. And let's go ahead and graph it nice and smooth. And now we're going clockwise, right, at -pi over 2. So you're really just going in the opposite direction, right? So we're at -2 here. So you're going to then go to -6, back to -2, back to 2, and back to -2, and make a nice smooth curve. To get the range of the function, think range as your minimum y value to your maximum y value. So that's going from -6 to 2. And in interval notation, it would be the hard bracket, -6 to 2. Now, before we continue on to the next problem, I just wanted to go over something because, one, there are many ways to graph these functions. So first, I wanted to just highlight that what exactly is that amplitude, aside being that value, that's the absolute value in front of the function. It represents the distance from the baseline, the midline, to the maximum value, or the baseline to the minimum value. So this is your amplitude. Oh, that doesn't show. We'll do it in green. So this is your amplitude, and this is your amplitude. It really represents how the function is varying from that midline. So it's either varying above the midline or below the midline. What exactly is the midline? Because I think I rushed it earlier today, so I just want to make sure people understand. So the midline is really the average value of the trig function. So it's the average of the max and minimum value. And you can see that formula here. And we're going to go over that tomorrow because we didn't cover a couple of examples. So you can skip number 4 from your homework because we're going to do that tomorrow. But again, the midline represents the average of that function, middle, right? How do you take the average? You're taking the max plus the min divided by 2. Okay. Okay. Let's go on to the next function. The next function we're going to graph in this video, and that's y equals -2 cosine x plus 3. And again, we're going to pull off the pertinent information. We're going to first pull up the amplitude, which is the absolute value of -2, and that's 2. So what does that -2? It reflects the curve over the x-axis. The vertical shift is 3, and so therefore the midline is y equals 3. So the graph was shifted up 3 spaces. So we're going to go ahead and graph it, and I like the purple line. So we're going to graph y equals 3. And always remember to label your graph. And next, we want to get the maximum value of the function. So the maximum value of the function is the amplitude plus the vertical shift. Notice that doesn't change, but just because there's a negative in the function, you still get the maximum value the same way. So it's 2 plus 3, or 5. The minimum value of the function is the negative of the amplitude plus the vertical shift. So in this case, you negate the 2, so it's -2 plus 3, and that's equal to 1. Notice it doesn't change just because you have a cosine in front versus sine, and just because you have a negative in front of the amplitude, it does not change how you calculate the minimum and maximum value of that function. Okay. What's the normal pattern for cosine? Well, again, everything is based on this unit circle. So cosine, think the x-coordinate. So typically you would graph 0, 1. Then you would graph pi over 2, 0. Pi, -1. Then it would be 3 pi over 2, 0. And back to 2 pi, 1. So normally, if there wasn't a negative in front of the function would be max, mid, min, mid, max. But because I'm reflecting the graph over the x-axis, what happens is the maximum becomes the minimum, and the minimum becomes the maximum. You're really taking the y values and you're multiplying everything by -1, and that's why that's happening. So I'm just going to erase that because I can. And again, there are many ways that you can graph these functions. I'm trying to take you through the easiest way to graph without the use of a calculator, because you really don't need that for these types of graphs. Okay, so the minimum value was 1, the midline was 3, the maximum is 5, the midline again is 3, and the minimum value is 1. And so now we can start graphing. So it's 1, 3, 5, 3, 1. We're making a nice smooth curve. And again, we're doing it to the other side as well. Again, you're going backwards with the other side. So it's 1, 3, 5, 3, 1, and a nice, beautiful, smooth, that's a pretty cosine curve. And we have 2 cycles graphed. One cycle is 2 pi until tomorrow when we change the frequency of the graph. Again, the amplitude is the distance from the maximum value to the baseline, so we see it's 2 units, or from the minimum value to the baseline. The amplitude represents how the function is varying from the middle of the graph. The midline is the average distance from the maximum to minimum value. And speaking of that, let's get the range. The range is the lowest point of the graph, which is 1, less than or equal to y, less than or equal to the maximum value. That's set notation. And the interval notation would be 1 to 5. And finally, I just want to go over 2 more problems on how to get the range. Like sometimes you want to get the range and you don't want to have to graph the whole function. Again, you can just use our formula that we use to calculate the maximum and minimum value of the function. So the maximum value of the function is the amplitude plus the vertical shift. So the amplitude is 5 and the vertical shift is 2. So that would be 7. And the minimum value of the graph is negative the amplitude plus the vertical shift. So that would be -5 plus 2 or -3. So in interval notation, the range is -3 to 7. And finally, I want to find the range for this function. Again, to get the maximum value of the function, you're going to take the amplitude plus the vertical shift, and that gives you 60. To get the minimum value of the function, it's the negative of the amplitude plus the vertical shift, which is 10, and the interval notation, that would be 10 to 60. I hope this video helps, and I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great evening.